Have you ever looked at the person sleeping next to you and felt completely alone? Not sad about something that happened, not angry, just hollow. Like there's a wall made of glass between the two of you and you can both see through it, but neither of you can break it. You share the same house, the same bed, the same last name. You have had children together. You have shared 1,000 ordinary mornings. And yet there is something unreachable between you, something that no conversation, no trip, no gesture ever quite touches. You keep trying. You keep hoping the next thing will close the distance. It never does. St. Teresa of Avila saw exactly this problem. She named it. She understood it in a way that still cuts close, almost 500 years later. And what she found, not in theory, but in her own devastated experience, was something most people never even think to look for. If you value documented spiritual history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also tell us in the comments what city you are watching from. This script is researched and factual, drawing primarily from two sources. Teresa's own autobiography, translated under the critical edition of P. Silverio de Santa Teresa, published in scholarly form by ICS Publications and available in the collected works, translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez, the most authoritative English rendering in existence. The second source is the interior castle itself, Teresa's seventh mansion chapter on spiritual marriage, cross-referenced with the critical Latin commentary of Tomás Alvarez in his Estudios Teresanos, a 3-volume scholarly work in Spanish that goes chapter by chapter through Teresa's manuscripts and has been called the definitive academic reference on her writings. Now back to the information. Teresa de Ahumada was born on March 28, 1515 in Avila, Spain, a walled city in the mountains of Castile, roughly 100 kilometers northwest of Madrid. Her family was wealthy. Her father, Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, had 12 children. Her mother, Beatriz de Ahumada, died when Teresa was just 13 years old. That number matters, 13, because the year Teresa lost her mother was the year she started running toward the wrong things. She read books of chivalry. She became obsessed with stories of romance and adventure. She admitted later that she was charming, vivacious, and very aware of it. In her autobiography, written decades later, she described her teenage years with remarkable honesty. She said she was focused on her appearance, on being admired, on the kind of friendships that pulled her away from God rather than toward Him. Her father was so alarmed by the direction she was heading that he sent her at age 16 to study at an Augustinian convent in Avila. He was not trying to make her a nun. He was trying to save her from a marriage she was clearly too young and too reckless to handle. It almost worked. But Teresa got sick during her time at the convent and had to return home. She recovered. And then came the decision that changed everything. In 1535, at the age of 20, Teresa entered the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation in Avila against her father's wishes. She later said she entered the convent not out of love for God, but out of fear of hell, fear of where her life was going. That is an extraordinary admission from someone who would later be declared a doctor of the church. She did not arrive holy, she arrived desperate. And here is what almost nobody talks about when they tell Teresa's story. For the next 20 years, 20 full years, she lived what she later called a life of total spiritual mediocrity inside the convent walls. The monastery of the Incarnation in 1535 was not a place of strict discipline. It was large, with as many as 180 nuns. Visitors came freely. Teresa received guests, held conversations, enjoyed social interaction. She was, by her own account, trying to serve two masters. She wanted God. She also wanted to be liked. She wanted spiritual depth. She also wanted distraction. And the tension between those two desires held her in a kind of suspended paralysis for 2 decades. This is the part of Teresa's story that connects directly to the loneliness inside marriage. Because what she was experiencing inside the convent was the same thing that millions of married people experience inside their homes. She was surrounded by people. She was never physically alone. She had relationships, obligations, community. People sought her out. She was charming, well-liked, a presence everyone wanted near. And yet she felt a hollowness at the center of everything. A gap between what her soul was reaching for and what the world around her could actually give. She described it in her autobiography, Chapter 8, with words that feel like they were written yesterday. The soul knows it is capable of something more, and it suffers because everything it touches leaves it unsatisfied. She went to prayer and felt nothing. She went to the parlor and laughed with visitors and felt, underneath the laughter, the same nothing. She was not depressed. She was not broken. She was functioning, contributing, present in all the visible ways. But the center was empty, and she knew it was empty, and the knowing made it worse. She wrote that during those 20 years, she prayed badly. She used her own word, badly, not infrequently, not imperfectly, badly. She would sit down to pray and spend the entire hour watching the hourglass and waiting for it to end. She compared herself to a person condemned, someone who had to be there but whose heart was entirely somewhere else. The people around her would never have guessed. From the outside, she was the nun who received the most visitors, who wrote the most letters, who laughed the most in community. From the inside, she was sitting in the first room of the castle and could not find the door to the second. Now, replace the Monastery of the Incarnation with a house in any city in the world right now. Replace the convent parlor with a kitchen table. Replace the 180 nuns with a spouse, 2 children, a dog, and a calendar full of obligations. The structure is identical. The person who smiles at dinner and cannot say what is wrong. The person who goes through every correct motion, the meals, the school runs, the weekend plans, and feels underneath all of it like they are watching their own life from a distance, present in body, missing in the place that matters. Now here is the most important thing to understand about how Teresa got there. She did not reach this insight by accident. She arrived at it through something that broke her completely open. In 1554, when Teresa was 39 years old, she walked past a small statue of Christ that had been placed in the convent corridor. It showed Christ wounded, covered in wounds from the Passion. It had been placed there temporarily, borrowed for a feast day. She stopped. She looked at it, and something inside her collapsed. She described the experience in her autobiography as a conversion. Not her first conversion, but her real one, the one that finally reached the part of her that had been hiding for 20 years. She wrote that she felt so grieved when she saw how poorly she had repaid those wounds that she threw herself down before the statue and begged God not to let her rise until he had mercy on her. She was 39 years old, weeping on a stone floor in an Avila convent in 1554, and she had spent her entire adult life trying to be holy while also keeping one hand on the world. That moment in the corridor was the end of the double life. What followed over the next 28 years, from 1554 until her death on October 4th, 1582 in Alba de Tormes, is one of the most documented mystical journeys in the history of Christianity. Teresa began to experience visions, locutions, and moments of union with God that left her physically immobile for hours at a time. Her confessor at first told her it was the devil. The Inquisition watched her. Theologians were called to evaluate her experiences, and through all of it, she wrote. She wrote relentlessly. She wrote her autobiography under obedience to her confessors. She wrote The Way of Perfection, completed around 1566, as a guide for her nuns. She began the interior castle on June 2nd, 1577, Trinity Sunday, and completed it by November 29th of the same year, 6 months. A masterpiece in 6 months, written in a small room in the Convent of the Incarnation while she was managing legal disputes, founding new convents, and dealing with her own illnesses. The interior castle is the key text. It describes the soul as a crystal castle with 7 rooms, or mansions, arranged from the outermost to the innermost. God lives at the center. The soul begins at the outside and makes its way in. And what Teresa describes across those 7 rooms is a journey from spiritual superficiality to complete union. A journey most people never finish, and many never truly begin. But here is what Teresa reveals early in that journey that almost nobody talks about. In the 2nd and 3rd mansions, the early rooms, where most people spend most of their lives, she describes a specific kind of suffering. It is the suffering of a soul that has made a real commitment but cannot feel anything. The soul prays, the soul tries, the soul follows the rules, and nothing comes back. Silence, dryness, the sense that the words are going nowhere. Teresa calls this spiritual aridity, a word that in Spanish carries the weight of a drought, a landscape where nothing grows. And she says directly that this is where most people give up, cold, flat, empty. And then Teresa does something remarkable. She compares this interior dryness to the experience of a marriage in which love has gone cold. She uses the comparison deliberately in The Way of Perfection, chapter 31, when she talks about the harmony between the faculties of the soul in prayer. She writes that when all 3 faculties, memory, understanding, and will, work together in prayer, it is like a husband and wife who love each other deeply. They want the same thing. They move in the same direction. But, she says, when the husband is unhappy in the marriage, he makes the wife restless too. Everything becomes effort. Everything becomes strain. The harmony is gone. She was describing prayer, but she was also describing something she had watched in the world around her. In 16th century Castile, marriage was not a choice made from love. It was arranged, often when the girl was barely out of childhood, between families negotiating land, money, and status. A woman in Avila in 1540 had almost no legal existence outside her husband. She could not own property independently. She could not appear in court without male representation. The domestic space was her entire world. And in that world, cut off from everything outside the 4 walls of a house she did not choose, loneliness was not an occasional feeling. It was the architecture of daily life. Teresa saw this. She had watched it in her mother, Beatriz de Ahumada, who died young, worn out, Teresa hints in her autobiography, by a kind of emotional and physical exhaustion that the books of chivalry she escaped into could never cure. Teresa watched women around her disappear inside marriages, where they were present in body and absent in everything else. And what she concluded from both observation and her own experience of spiritual dryness was this: the loneliness people feel inside a marriage is almost never about the marriage. It is about what the soul is missing that no human being can give it. This is not a convenient spiritual bypass. Teresa was not telling women to simply be satisfied with unhappiness by finding God and forgetting about their marriages. She was pointing to something structural, something built into the design of the soul itself. She says in the interior castle, First Mansion, Chapter 2, that the soul's center, the deepest room of the castle, is where God dwells, and that any darkness the soul experiences comes not from a flaw in the soul, but from the attachments that block the light from reaching it. She writes, "We are creatures and not our creator," and she means it in the most literal way. There's a space inside the human person that was made for something infinite. Another human being, no matter how good, no matter how loving, no matter how present, cannot fill an infinite space. They are finite. The space is not. Here is how Teresa puts it in the Fifth Mansion, Chapter 4. Words she says she cannot avoid, even though she knows they are imprecise. She is trying to describe the difference between what a human being can offer and what God can offer to the soul. She writes that the spiritual joys the Lord gives are 1,000 leagues removed from the delights experienced in marriage. 1,000 leagues, that is roughly 3,000 miles. She is not saying human marriage is bad. She is saying the soul has a hunger that runs 3,000 miles deeper than anything marriage can touch. Think about what that means for the person lying awake at 3 a.m. next to someone they love but cannot reach. The problem is not that their spouse is failing them, although maybe the spouse is. The problem is not that they married the wrong person, though maybe they did. The problem might be something older and stranger than any of that. The problem might be that they are trying to fill a 3,000-mile hunger with something that reaches, at best, 1 mile deep. Subscribe if this kind of documented spiritual history matters to you. It genuinely helps the channel. And drop your city in the comments. We want to know where you are. Now back to the information. In 1572, on November 18th, the date is recorded precisely because Teresa herself noted it, she experienced what she called her spiritual betrothal. This was a formal category in her mystical framework, distinct from ordinary prayer and distinct from the final spiritual marriage. It came in the 6th mansion of the interior castle, the mansion of the betrothed. She was 57 years old. She had been a nun for 37 years. She had founded the first discalced Carmelite convent in Avila in 1562, established with 13 nuns and a rule stricter than anything that existed in Spain at the time. No property, no individual income, 4 hours of prayer daily, strict enclosure. She had been investigated by the Inquisition. She had written more than 300 letters that still survive. And it was not until November 18th, 1572, that she entered what she recognized as a formal engagement with God. The spiritual marriage, the 7th mansion, came sometime between that date and May of 1575, when the scholars place it, though the exact date cannot be fixed. She was between 58 and 60 years old. Why does the timeline matter? Because it dismantles the romantic idea that Teresa was some effortless mystic floating above ordinary life. She spent 20 years in mediocrity. She had her real conversion at 39. She did not reach the deepest union the soul is capable of until she was nearly 60. The journey was long, brutal, and stripped of comfort at every stage. And what she found at the center of the castle is something she struggles to describe, which is part of why her descriptions are so powerful. She uses 3 images: rain falling from the sky into a river. They become the same water, indivisible, a stream flowing into the ocean. No separation afterward. 2 windows on opposite walls, both letting in daylight. The 2 beams enter separately and become a single light. These are not metaphors for something soft or comfortable. She is describing a union so complete that the boundaries between the soul and God stop being meaningful. And she says the effect of arriving at this union is not ecstasy or religious feeling. The effect is peace, a peace that does not go away, a peace that holds even while the body suffers, even while the world attacks, even while grief comes. She writes in the 7th mansion, Chapter 3, that after this union, the soul experiences something she had never found in the previous 6 rooms, a tranquility that does not depend on circumstances. Now bring that back to the person inside the lonely marriage. Because Teresa does not just describe the destination. She describes what the road looks like and what happens to everything else when you begin to walk it. In the 6th mansion, Chapter 1, she writes about a soul that has come far enough to understand what it is really hungering for but has not yet received it. She says the soul in this stage feels a strange loneliness. It cannot find companionship in any earthly creature. She writes that all society becomes, in a certain sense, a torture to the soul, not because people are bad, but because none of them are what the soul is now looking for. The soul has tasted something different, and everything else has become insufficient. She describes the soul as suspended in midair, not belonging fully to the earth, and not yet arrived in the place it is reaching for. That description fits the experience of loneliness in marriage with an almost violent precision. The person who feels alone beside their spouse is not imagining things. They are not being dramatic. They have encountered the edge of what human love can give, and the edge is real. The love may be real too. The marriage may be functional, even good in many ways, but the soul keeps standing at that edge, looking past it and not knowing what it is looking at. Teresa's answer is not to abandon the marriage. She is writing primarily for nuns, but she knew the world. She founded 17 monasteries across Castile and Andalusia. She dealt constantly with lay people, with nobles, with merchants, with married women who came to her through the convent grill and poured out their lives to her. She gave spiritual direction to people in every state of life. And her answer, across all those conversations and all those letters, was consistent. The loneliness is a signal. It is not a problem to be solved by changing the external circumstances. It is an invitation. She says, in The Way of Perfection, that prayer, real prayer, not the mumbling of words, but the act of turning toward God with the full weight of who you are, is simply conversation between friends. She defines it that way in a sentence that was later quoted by the Catechism of the Catholic Church in its section on contemplative prayer. She writes, "Contemplative prayer is nothing else than a close sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with him who we know loves us. That definition strips away every mystical category, every technical term, every barrier of education or religious status. Frequent time, alone, with someone who loves you. That is the thing," she says, the soul is starving for. Dry, quiet, still. And here's what happens, according to Teresa, when a person inside a lonely marriage begins to actually do this. Not reads about it, does it. Begins the practice of turning inward, even badly, even distractedly, even for 15 minutes in the morning before the house wakes up. The first thing that happens is nothing. The first mansion and the second mansion are almost entirely nothing. The soul prays and hears silence. The soul tries to concentrate and the mind wanders immediately to the grocery list and the argument from 3 days ago and the email that still has not been answered. Teresa is brutally honest about this. In The Way of Perfection, chapter 19, she writes that for more than 14 years she could not practice mental prayer without a book to keep her focused. 14 years. The woman who would become the first female doctor of the church could not sit quietly with God for 14 years without needing something to hold the distraction at bay. She is telling you that the difficulty you feel is not a sign that it is not working. It is the normal texture of the road. She is also telling you something that the modern self-help world gets completely backwards. The modern approach to loneliness inside a marriage is to diagnose the marriage, communicate better, plan more connection time, go to therapy, try harder. All of those things have their place, and Teresa would not have dismissed them. But she would have said that before any of that, there is a prior question. What are you actually hungry for? And is it something another human being can give you? Because if the hunger is the kind she is describing, the deep structural longing at the center of the soul, then no amount of communication will reach it. You can have the most honest conversation of your marriage and still go to bed feeling alone. Not because the conversation was wrong, but because the conversation was aimed at a problem that conversation cannot solve. Teresa had that problem. She solved it, not quickly, not without enormous difficulty, but she solved it, and she left precise instructions. The second thing that happens, over time, and Teresa is careful to say this comes in God's time, not the soul's schedule, is a shift. It does not announce itself dramatically. Teresa describes it in the fourth mansion as a different kind of water reaching the soul. In the first 3 rooms, you draw water from a well. You work, you pull, you carry. The water comes, but only because of your effort. In the fourth mansion, God begins to bring the water to you. The effort decreases. The nourishment increases. And the soul starts to notice that the thing it was starving for, the thing it was looking for in its spouse and in its friendships and in its ambitions and in every distraction it could find, is beginning to arrive from another direction entirely. Teresa is precise about what this does not mean. It does not mean the marriage becomes irrelevant. It does not mean the husband or wife is now replaceable. It does not mean prayer is a substitute for a real relationship or a way of avoiding the hard conversations that marriages require. What it means is that the soul stops asking the marriage to carry what the marriage was never built to carry. The 3,000-mile hunger gets addressed at the right level. And paradoxically, and Teresa documents this in the lives of the nuns she directed, and in her letters to lay people, hundreds of which survive in her collected letters published by ICS Publications, when the soul stops demanding the infinite from a finite person, the finite relationship becomes lighter, cleaner, possible. The spouse who is suffocating under the weight of an impossible expectation can breathe. The person who is lonely can stop reaching past their partner for something that was never there and start seeing who is actually in front of them. This is one of the most practically useful things Teresa ever wrote, even though she writes it in mystical language and addresses it to nuns. The principle is simple. When you stop trying to get everything from one source, that source stops being crushed by the demand. A marriage in which both people are separately rooted in something deeper than the marriage is a marriage in which neither person is being asked to be God. That is the only condition under which two ordinary human beings can actually be good to each other over the long run, not because they are perfect, not because they never fail each other, but because neither of them is carrying a weight they were never designed to hold. She describes this shift in terms of Martha and Mary, the two sisters from the Gospel of Luke. Mary sat at the feet of Jesus. Martha ran around the house managing everything. Most people read that story as a rebuke to Martha. Teresa reads it differently. In the Seventh Mansion, chapter 4, her final chapter in the interior castle, she says that the goal is not to become Mary and abandon Martha. The goal is for Martha and Mary to live together in the same person without tension. Action and contemplation, activity and silence, presence in the world and rootedness in God. Not one or the other, but both at once, in a peace that holds them together. A married person living this, she says, is not escaping into prayer to avoid their spouse. They are bringing something back from the interior castle into the ordinary rooms of ordinary life. They come back from 15 minutes of silent prayer and wash the dishes differently. They come back and listen differently. They come back and stop needing the constant reassurance that the other person loves them, because the deepest part of that need has been met somewhere the other person could not reach anyway. This is not comfortable teaching. It asks something real. It requires the humility to admit that the loneliness you feel next to your spouse is partly about them and partly about something that was always in you, something that would have been lonely beside any person on earth, something that was never going to be solved by finding the right partner or having a better conversation or planning the right vacation. It requires sitting in silence when every instinct pulls toward noise. It requires persisting through the 14 years of distraction that Teresa herself endured. But the payoff, if payoff is even the right word, is documented by one of the most rigorous and honest observers the Church has ever produced. Teresa of Avila was not a woman who settled for comfortable answers. She was investigated by the Spanish Inquisition. She was told by a confessor that her experiences came from the devil. She founded 17 convents in one of the most difficult ecclesiastical environments in European history, negotiating with bishops, dukes, and King Philip II of Spain himself. She was not soft. She was not vague. She was one of the sharpest minds of the 16th century, operating in a world that gave almost no structural support to women who thought or led or wrote. And she says, in plain language, that the loneliness inside a marriage is solvable, not by fixing the marriage, by going deeper than the marriage, by walking into the interior castle, one room at a time, and discovering what is waiting at the center, by understanding that the spouse beside you was never the destination. They were always a companion for a road that leads somewhere else entirely. She also documents something about what this does to the soul's relationship with suffering. In the third mansion, the room where most good, sincere, faithful people spend most of their lives, the soul is doing everything right and feeling almost nothing. Teresa says this is the stage where the soul is most in danger, not from obvious sin, but from a quiet, respectable mediocrity. The soul has built good habits. It goes to prayer. It avoids serious wrongdoing. It is, by any external measure, a decent person. But inside, it is managing. It is controlling. It is not surrendered. And the loneliness it feels in marriage and friendship and every relationship is the symptom of that non-surrender. The soul has not yet given God the one thing he is asking for, the will. This distinction matters enormously for the person inside a difficult marriage, because the third mansion version of a marriage is the most painful and the most invisible. It is not a marriage that is visibly failing. It is a marriage where both people are trying, where neither person is obviously wrong, where the children are fed and the house is kept and the schedule is maintained, and yet there is no light in the middle of it. There is compliance without joy, presence without intimacy, correctness without life. Teresa saw this everywhere in the 16th century, and she has a precise name for it. The soul is in the third mansion, and it cannot get to the fourth because it will not let go of control. It keeps trying to manage the experience of God the same way it manages the household, and God, she says, will not be managed. The passage from the third mansion to the fourth is the passage from what you do to what is done to you. It is the transition from effort to gift, and it cannot be forced. It can only be prepared for by sitting in the silence long enough to stop expecting something you can control. Teresa says, in The Way of Perfection, chapter 21, that the whole of spiritual progress depends on one thing, the soul's determination never to give up. Not perfection, not success, not the absence of distraction or dryness or confusion, just the refusal to stop walking. She writes that as long as we do not allow ourselves to be defeated, success is guaranteed. Not comfort, not consolation, not the end of loneliness, but arrival, Eventually, inevitably, a rival. She died on October 4th, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, in a small room in a convent she had just helped to found. She was 67 years old. She had been on the road since 1535 when she entered the Incarnation. That is 47 years of walking. The last words recorded by those present in the room were addressed to God, not to the sisters gathered around her. She did not say goodbye. She said, "Lord, I am a daughter of the Church." And then she was gone. Her body was taken to Avila. Then her right arm was removed and sent to Lisbon. Her left hand was cut off and taken to Ronda. Her heart was removed and placed in a reliquary. Her foot was separated from her body. By the 17th century, pieces of Teresa of Avila existed in reliquaries across Spain and Portugal and Rome and Latin America. The Church, which had investigated her for possible demonic influence, was now distributing her body across the continent. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII canonized her. In 1614, she was beatified, in the wrong order because the process was reversed, as often happened in that era. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her the first female doctor of the Church, placing her alongside Augustine and Thomas Aquinas as one of the official great teachers of Catholic theology. None of that changes what she said. None of the relics and the canonizations and the titles touch the core claim, which is simple enough to write in one sentence. The thing you are looking for in the person next to you is not there, and it was never there. And the sooner you stop looking for it there, the sooner you find where it actually is. The lonely marriage is not a failure. It is a door. Teresa spent 50 years finding out what was on the other side of it. And what she found, in a small room in a Spanish convent in 1577, was something she could only describe as rain falling into a river, two things becoming one thing, so completely that afterward you cannot tell where one ended and the other began. There is a detail that the scholars of Teresa's manuscripts have only recently confirmed through comparison of the autograph copy, the manuscript written in her own hand, with the copies that circulated during her lifetime. In the interior castle, the chapter on the seventh mansion, the description of the soul's peace after spiritual marriage, was altered by a copyist in the early 1700s to make it sound more emotionally elevated, more rapturous. The original phrasing, recovered from the Salamanca manuscript, is far quieter. The soul in the seventh mansion does not experience joy. It experiences what Teresa's Spanish calls quietude, quiet. A quiet so complete it no longer needs to be called peace, because it has nothing to be at peace from. That is not the ending most people want, but it is the one Teresa left.